After Gloria eating a heart-shaped school lunch at the school for Valentine's Day 2022, this story about Thaddeus Bile and Taryn Bile having romantic, but they are serial killers who kills peoples. The story starts, at the night, the sky was black, the buildings were very tall. Thaddeus Bile walks up to the city. "Hi. Thaddeus Bile." A blue female monster said. It was Thaddeus Bile's girlfriend, Taryn Bile, who is holding a knife covered in the blood. "Hello, Taryn Bile." Thaddeus Bile said. "Thaddeus, you know this is a dangerous place to be." Taryn Bile said. "I am not afraid of anyone, Taryn Bile." Thaddeus Bile asked. "Thaddeus, you're not going to do anything stupid?" Taryn Bile cooed. "Don't worry, I will be fine." Thaddeus Bile said. "Hey, you can't say that." Taryn Bile said. "I am going to kill you." Thaddeus Bile said. He started up his chainsaw. Thaddeus Bile and Taryn Bile plan to kill peoples. PNG Thaddeus Bile and Taryn Bile laughing manically to plan to kill peoples. You know our romantic serial killers? Myself asked in confused. At the bedroom at night, a boy resembles the robot boy in Monsters, Incorporated, who is sleeping on his bed. A boy wakes up and fearfully walks to the door. A boy opens the door, but Thaddeus Bile and Taryn Bile appears out of the door. "Peekaboo!" Thaddeus Bile shouted, causing the boy to screaming loudly in fear. Taryn Bile giggling manically then said, well, the boy must have something he would like to tell us." "Yes, I have something I would like to tell you." Thaddeus Bile said. "No." A boy cried in fear. "Are you ready?" "I killed boy." Thaddeus Bile shouted, as his voice faded to a demonic effect. Thaddeus Bile started up his chainsaw and Taryn Bile raised her knife in the air to kill the boy. The boy panicked. No. "Please don't kill me. Don't do this. No. We're young boy. No. No. Taryn Bile stabs the boy in his throat with a knife. Then Thaddeus Bile cuts the boy in his waist with a chainsaw. The boy lets out a blood-curdling scream due to Thaddeus Bile kills him with his chainsaw. Thaddeus Bile and Taryn Bile laughing manically as the dead boy. At the office at night, a man named James leaving the office and ambushed by Thaddeus Bile and Taryn Bile. "Hello, James." Thaddeus Bile said. James gasped in fear. "Yeah, and it's nice to see that you are still alive," Taryn Bile said with her sinister grin. James was shocked and wanted to run, but Taryn Bile blocked his way. Taryn Bile stabs James in the chest. James painfully crawls away from Taryn Bile. Thaddeus Bile about to kill James with a chainsaw. I can hear the sound of chainsaw buzzing and the sound of a man screaming, meaning that Thaddeus Bile kills James with his chainsaw. At the street at night, a woman named Wendy using her phone, while walking down the street. Thaddeus Bile and Taryn Bile appear in front of her. "Hello, Wendy," Thaddeus Bile said. Wendy screaming and pointing at Thaddeus Bile and Taryn Bile, screamed in fear. "Unromantic couple of a monsters." "Yes, Wendy. But we are not monsters. We are normal human beings, we are just serial killers." Taryn Bile asked. "You are going to die, Wendy," Thaddeus Bile said, ready to kill Wendy. Thaddeus Bile almost kills Wendy in her waist with his chainsaw. Taryn Bile ready to stab Wendy. "No. Please. I don't kill. No. No. Wendy panicked. Taryn Bile stabs Wendy in her chest with a knife. At that moment, Taryn Bile ripped the heart out of Wendy. A dead Wendy falls on the ground. Thaddeus Bile and Taryn Bile laughing manically as the dead Wendy. At the street at night, Thaddeus Bile and Taryn Bile walked up the street, stopped by the police cock with a gun pointing. "Hey you. A romantic couple of serial killer monsters. We have to arrest you." A police cock man shouted. Thaddeus and Taryn looked at each other. "You have to arrest us, this is not a good idea," Thaddeus Bile said to the police cock. "Oh, you have to be arrested, we have to arrest you. You are a couple of serial killer monsters," the police cock said with an angry face. Thaddeus Bile and Taryn Bile is surrounded by the police cops with the guns pointing. "Why do you want to arrest us? We are just two normal people trying to have a romantic night out," Thaddeus Bile said. "You are going kill police cops." Taryn Bile and Thaddeus Bile got ready to kill their victims. Taryn Bile raised her knife in the air and Thaddeus Bile raised his chainsaw in the air. Thaddeus Bile is about to cut the police cop with a chainsaw and Taryn Bile is about to stab the police cop with her knife. I could hear the sound of blood splatter and the sound of the police cops screaming, meaning that Thaddeus Bile and Taryn Bile kills the police cops. Thaddeus Bile and Taryn Bile laughing manically, as a pile of the dead police cops. Oh, dear, myself asked. At the street at night, Thaddeus Bile, who is holding his chainsaw and Taryn Bile, who is holding her knife chasing the peoples. At that moment, Thaddeus Bile cuts a man with a chainsaw, while Taryn Bile stabs a woman in her back in multiple times. Thaddeus Bile and Taryn Bile are about to kill the peoples. All I could hear was blood splattering, the chainsaw, knife stabbing, the evil laughters of Thaddeus Bile and Taryn Bile and the people's blood-curdling screams. What the hell am I watching? I asked myself in a low monotone. After Thaddeus Bile and Taryn Bile killing the peoples, a pile of the dead bodies of the peoples on ground. Thaddeus Bile and Taryn Bile walk away from a pile of the dead bodies of the peoples. Taryn Bile, we've killed more than 200 people. Thaddeus Bile said. Yes, Thaddeus Bile, I know that. Taryn Bile said. But now we'll be able to enjoy life for the rest of our lives. Thaddeus Bile said. Yes, Thaddeus Bile. Taryn Bile said. Taryn Bile, I love you. Thaddeus Bile said. I love you too, Thaddeus Bile. Taryn Bile said. Thaddeus Bile and Taryn Bile kissing each other. The video was ended. This is nightmare about Thaddeus Bile and Taryn Bile killing the peoples. My romantic couple of blue monsters become serial killers? Myself said.